Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today to go over our March webinar where we will talk about Google Analytics 4. Let me share my screen and we will get started. So, as I mentioned, today's webinar is covering an overview of Google Analytics 4, really focusing on how we can configure the platform to help you maximize insights for your business. I am Rachel McMahon. I am an SEO strategist here at Anvil. And today we are really going to introduce Google Analytics 4, walk through some of the important features, and make sure that you have what you need to get comfortable and start really leveraging the platform. So before I get started, just a few things that I wanted to take care of. The first is that a copy of this webinar deck is going to be available for download on our website. I highly recommend that you check out the download because there is going to be an appendix section within this webinar deck that will be really useful in the future if you wanted to reference back some of the steps that we talk about, some of the configurations we talk about, things like that. All of that will be within the appendix deck and the appendix section of the deck, and it really clearly lays out some of the steps that you'll need to take, some resources, things like that. So definitely check out our website to download the webinar deck for future use. And then the next thing is that this video will actually be available on our YouTube channel as well. So if you wanted to replay this webinar, you can visit the Anvil Media YouTube channel to view this webinar as well as some of our previous webinars that we've had in the past. So without further ado, we will jump in and get started. So some of the things that we'll cover today will go into a pretty quick introduction of Google Analytics 4, what it is, what the new metrics look like, and what the interface and some of the new reporting features look like as well. We'll talk about Google Analytics 4 Events, the e-commerce reporting. We'll talk about some other considerations, other important pieces of information to know, and then we will wrap up with a conclusion for the end of the webinar. And as I mentioned, you can see at the very end, there is an appendix where I've laid out some very easy to follow steps, instructions. We've included links to resources to really help you set yourself up for success and make sure you have everything you need to really start doing a deeper dive into Google Analytics 4. So we will start off by introducing Google Analytics 4. And so the reason Google launched this new version of Google Analytics, or GA4, was to really help digital marketers and website owners prepare for some of the changes that have been occurring within the digital marketing landscape. So there have been changes to cookie restrictions, there have been privacy concerns, there have been changes in our data collection abilities. So this new version of Google Analytics really helps to make sure we will have everything we need in order to not only abide by some of these changes, but we will be able to thoroughly and effectively use Google Analytics in the long run. Do you have to use Google Analytics 4 at the very moment? And the answer to that is no. At the very moment, it is not a requirement to have a Google Analytics 4 property, but Anvil Media, we recommend that you at least create and install a Google Analytics 4 property just so that you can start acquiring data within it. So in the long run, once Google actually makes us effectively switch to a Google Analytics 4 property, you won't have to start from scratch. You'll already have a GA4 property that has historical data within it. So that way it'll just be an easy transition for you. We do have instructions on how you can create a Google Analytics 4 property, how you can install a Google Analytics 4 property, and even how you can upgrade an existing Universal Analytics property as well. All of those can be found within the appendix of this deck. And there's easy step-by-step instructions and very clear visualizations for you to follow. So definitely reference the appendix of this deck. Also, something important to note is that Google Tag Manager is really going to be your friend here. So Google Tag Manager is another free platform offered by Google that is a way for you to quickly and easily install Google Analytics and also implement event tracking and there's some other really cool features about Google Tag Manager as well. While this webinar is really focused on GA4, I won't go into too much detail about Google Tag Manager. Everything that you really do need to know is, again, within the appendix section of this deck. But basically, Google Tag Manager is really going to make it a lot easier for you to implement some of the items that we'll talk about in just a minute, and it will just make your life a lot easier. So we highly recommend that you not only just have Google Tag Manager, but that you really leverage it for the requirements within Google Analytics 4 as well. So before we take a look at the new interface, it is important to understand the basic differences between Universal Analytics and GA4. So historically, Universal Analytics has really been focused on traffic and your sessions and your users. You can see on the left-hand side, metrics that we've seen within Universal Analytics are, sessions, we have bounce rate, we have pages per session, we have average session duration, but Google Analytics 4 has actually shifted to a more events-based model. So instead of focusing more on traffic, we are really focused on events and engagement. So you can see the new metrics that we are really focused on are things like engaged sessions, engagement rate, engaged sessions per user, and even average engagement time. So we're shifting away from a sessions-based model to a more events-based model. And so here is the interface that we all know and love. This is what Universal Analytics currently looks like. And as you'll see in just a moment, GA4 looks pretty different than what we're used to seeing within Universal Analytics. So again, take it in. This is what we're all used to seeing within Universal Analytics. But now what we see is this interface within GA4. So you can see while we still do have the toolbar on the left-hand side, the scorecards and other data within the middle, the actual interface is somewhat different, and you can definitely see that the reports themselves and the organization of the main menu is much different. So instead of having those 5 separate reports that you see on the left-hand side, we now have Explore, Advertising, and Configure available to us as well. So some pretty big differences in the interface and also within the reports and the tools that we have in GA4 as well. So with the GA4 reports, you can see we have a few different reports that we can really utilize. So the first is the real-time report. This really hasn't changed from Universal Analytics. This is still the report that you can access to see what is currently happening real-time on your website. Acquisition is another report that really hasn't changed too much. This is where we will understand how traffic has found our website or our app. Engagement is a report that shows us user behavior and gives us an understanding of how users are interacting with web pages and site elements. So engagement is where we are going to get pieces of information like for events and conversions. We also have monetization. This is the new e-commerce reporting where you'll see revenue, promotion, performance, product performance, and all of those other pieces of information that come within the e-commerce reporting. Retention is a report that is going to help us understand overall retention by both new and returning users, but we'll also get to see and get an understanding of overall lifetime value as well. And then at the very bottom are the user reports that are pretty similar to what we've seen in Universal Analytics, where demographics will get things like locations, gender, and interests. We'll also be able to see the tech report that gives us devices, browsers, and operating systems. So some things remained the same or similar. Some things have changed quite a bit, but this gives you an overview of what those individual reports what pieces of information you can get from those individual reports. So starting with acquisition, again, this is telling you and helping you understand where your traffic actually comes from. So if we are really putting efforts towards improving our SEO performance, we will obviously, want to check in on how organic is doing. If you're running paid campaigns, it's a great way for you to validate performance within that particular area. So in terms of what stays the same is the channel. So Google Analytics is still going to use the same method, the same terminology to really categorize that traffic. But what is different is the acquisition report is now going to have 2 main categories. You'll see user acquisition and you will see traffic acquisition. User acquisition is going to be focused on the individual user. whereas traffic acquisition is going to be focused on the actual session. So if you can remember and think back to the universal analytics side of things, one single user can have multiple sessions. So the way to really think about this is the user acquisition is going to focus on the individual and mostly the first-time users, whereas your traffic acquisition is going to be really focused on the session and the overall, traffic as a group, as a whole that comes to your website. So that's the main difference. But again, the channels are going to stay the same. The categorization is going to stay the same. So acquisition is a more familiar report in GA4. We also have engagement. So this used to somewhat be the behavior report that you've seen in Universal Analytics. Engagement is where we'll see things like our event tracking, user engagements, and even the conversion data as well. So what is staying the same is how events and conversions are understood. So events are still any of those user interactions that occur within your website. And then conversions are those more important user actions that represent what your ultimate goals are in terms of having users come to your site and then completing the desired action. So understanding the definitions of events and conversions, those are still the same within GA4. What's different in the engagement side of things is that we have pages and screens instead of page views. So that is one of the main differences you'll see. And yeah, it's just a different way to take a look at that particular engagement data. But another thing that's really great about GA4 is that you will have the capabilities to create custom events directly within the platform itself. So we will get into some specifics in just a moment, but basically you will be able to create events directly within GA4 without having to navigate elsewhere or use any other additional platform. So that is a pretty cool feature of GA4. The monetization report, this is a newer report for GA4. Again, this is the e-commerce reporting side of things. We will get into some specifics in just a moment, but as a heads up, we will recommend that you use Google Tag Manager in terms of implementations, installations, and really populating the monetization report. But again, we'll get into some specifics in just a moment. But basically with the monetization report, you'll still see all of your standard e-commerce data, product purchases, revenue, shopping behaviors, things like that. But what's different really, again, is the setup. So with Universal Analytics, it was really easy to implement what we called enhanced e-commerce. But these days with the monetization report, it really does require the configuration within Google Tag Manager. So we will get into that in just a moment, but that is really the main difference between Universal and GA4 in terms of the e-commerce reporting side of things. We also have retention. So this is a pretty new report offered within Google Analytics. This is where you can understand how frequent your users will return to your website, how long they typically stay on your website, how long they're engaged on your website. And as you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, you can also understand what the lifetime value of your users are, what that lifetime value is as well. So you can really get a sense of, not only how often people are coming to your site, how long they're engaging with site elements, but what that lifetime value is over time. So retention is also a good report to know. And then lastly, we have the demographics and tech reports. Again, this is where you can really learn about location, device, user operating systems, languages, and more. And what stays the same is that information. So we've been able to get that information within Universal Analytics. So that is just another similarity between the two different types of properties. Whereas the only thing that's really different is that you won't have to navigate to all of those individual reports as you would within Universal Analytics. All of that information is housed within these two reports where it's categorized into demographics and in the tech reports as well. So you'll have everything you need directly within those two sections. So it's a little bit more efficient to extract some of these pieces of information. So next we will do a deeper dive on GA4 events. So events, again, are just user interactions that occur within your website. So it's a little different on the GA4 side, whereas in Universal Analytics, you were used to seeing things like the event category, action, and event label. In GA4, there is a different configuration, whereas there's 4 different kinds of events that you can utilize. There are automatically collected events, enhanced measurement events, recommended events, and custom events. And so as you can see on the right-hand side within that infographic, it clearly lays out how you can understand what type of event will be the best for your particular situation. But the most important piece of information in terms of GA4 events is that event names are case sensitive. So from Google, what they've explicitly said is that if you have 2 events that are named the same, but one has a capital letter, one has a lowercase letter, Google Analytics 4 will understand those as 2 completely different events. So case sensitive, the naming conventions have to match exactly as GA4 has provided instruction, because otherwise it won't implement properly and it will cause issues in the long run. So make sure you pay attention to the names and the case sensitivity within the naming conventions as well. What's really helpful too is that Google has compiled all of this information within a reference guide, which you can access at the very bottom. It will give you the names, the pieces of information, required information that you'll need to know to successfully implement all of these events. So starting off with automatic events, these are events that automatically come with Google Analytics 4. Once you have installed Google Analytics 4 onto your website, these events will automatically get tracked. There's nothing additional that you have to do in order to have these events start to track and acquire data. So automatic events include first visit. So when somebody first comes to your website, a page view, so whatever page the user is viewing. We also have session start, which is when the user's session actually started, and then user engagement. So when somebody has spent at least 10 seconds on your website. So that's what's really nice about Google Analytics 4 in terms of efficiency. You don't have to do any additional configuration. Again, these are automatically provided to you once you've installed Google Analytics 4. We also have enhanced measurement events. So enhanced events are only going to start collecting data when you have enabled them. So in order to enable them, you have to access that through the admin section of Google Analytics 4, but they're really easy to enable or disable depending on what your needs are. But some of the enhanced measurement events include scroll data, so seeing how far users scroll on any given page, outbound clicks, so if a user clicks on a link that takes them away from your internal website, site search, when a user engages with your website's search function, if you have a search bar and they click and type something in, that is what that particular event is for. Video engagement, so if somebody views a YouTube video that you have embedded on your site, and then download. So if a user downloads a file from your website, that is part of the enhanced measurement events as well. So again, to enable these, to start acquiring data for these particular events, you just navigate to the admin section. It's the gear icon in the bottom left-hand corner. Within the property column, you can see in this middle screenshot, we will click on data streams. That will show this particular window that you see on the right-hand side. You'll want to make sure that web is selected, and then you will be able to see this enhanced measurement section. You can enable all of those events. You can disable all of the events. You could choose, 1 to 2, depending again, what your particular needs are, what your particular interests are. And again, these are not set in stone. You could always turn these on, turn these off, and change whatever enhanced measurement events you are currently tracking. So again, these are events that you need to actually enable in order to start acquiring data for them. We also have recommended events. So these are somewhat similar to enhanced measurement events in that they require you to implement them first in order to start getting data. But with recommended events, these come with predefined names, and there are required parameters that Google needs, which parameters just provide additional information, additional context to Google and to Google Analytics, the Google Analytics 4 property. So that way you'll have maximum insights from that particular set of data. So again, with Google Analytics 4, I highly recommend that you reference this recommended events table, but to give you some examples of the recommended events we have available to us, there are things like add to cart. So obviously that's when a user adds an item to a shopping cart. We have purchases. So if a user has completed the transaction and has actually made a purchase. We have signups, so the number of account signups that occur within your website. We have view promotion, so if a user views some sort of promotion that you have running on your website. And then we also can do ad impression, which this is only for apps. So if you have a user who sees one of your promotions within the app that they're using, that will get counted as the ad impression recommended event. So in order to implement these, you can do so with Google Tag Manager. Again, what's really important here is focusing on the naming convention. So again, making sure everything looks exactly as Google has it, and then focusing on some of those required parameters as well. And then lastly, we also have custom events in Google Analytics 4. So custom events are saved for instances that aren't supported by the previous 3 events that we just covered. So if you have a situation that is not an automatic event, it's not in one of the enhanced measurements events, and it's not a recommended event, you can actually go in through Google Analytics 4 and create a custom event directly within the platform. So this could be found within the configure section of Google Analytics 4. And basically what you do is you set the conditions for the event so that Google Analytics will understand what will count as an event and what won't. And then that way you'll be able to have an event that tracks what your current situation looks like. So for example, if you want to have an event that tracks large purchases on your site that where the purchase exceeds $100, you would essentially have to create a custom event, because the only event that we really have in terms of the recommended events is the purchase event. But in this case, you're really focusing on the purchases that exceed that value of $100. So you could create a custom event within Google Analytics 4 with the conditions that the user has made completed a purchase and the purchase equaled or exceeded $100. So setting those conditions will help determine whether or not your event will count as a large purchase. And so that way, by configuring this custom event, you will also have this particular piece of information available to you as well. So again, custom events are really saved for those special situations that aren't supported by the other types of events. And it's really easy to create these. You just access the event configuration within the configure menu item on the left-hand side. And then you just set your conditions and you are good to go in terms of using custom events. Next, we will do an overview of the e-commerce reporting. So in GA4, this is probably where there's a huge difference between Universal Analytics and Google Analytics 4. With Universal Analytics, again, to enable enhanced e-commerce, basically you would just have to flip a switch to get all of that data. But within Google Analytics 4, you're really, again, going to need the help of Google Tag Manager to create and deploy some of the events that come with the e-commerce side of things. And another thing that's really helpful is to also have some way to create or complete mock transactions. So you'll need a way to pretend that you are, shopping for a product and actually purchasing a product. So that way you don't mess with any inventory, or you won't have to actually, front that cost yourself. So creating a situation where you can pretend that you're purchasing a product will also help set yourself up for success. So Google Tag Manager, and you'll need some sort of testing environment as well. So with GA4 Ecommerce Events, basically all of these will have to be manually set up with Google Tag Manager. And all of these will get populated within the monetization report. And again, with Google Analytics, they have this events reference guide to give you more information about what types of e-commerce events are available, how you need to set them up, what their requirements are, things like that. So again, I highly recommend referencing that when you are ready to set up some of these events. But first thing that's super important, again, are the event names. So each type of event has a specific naming convention. And in order to have these events successfully populate within Google Analytics 4, you'll need to use a correct name. So you'll see with the events we have here, add to cart, begin checkout, purchase, and view item, those need to appear exactly as they do here within your configuration. So don't, within the add to cart event, don't capitalize the A, don't leave out the underscores, things like that. It has to match exactly. And then you've heard me mention required parameters, which parameters are just, again, additional pieces of data about each event. They provide additional context about what's occurring within the event. And so for each e-commerce event, Google Analytics 4 has required parameters. So you have to include those parameters in order for the event to successfully populate. So if you don't include the required parameters, you won't see that information appear within Google Analytics 4. So again, the required parameters can be found within that reference guide that we have linked at the very top. But looking to some of the events that we've already introduced. So for add to cart, the required parameters would be the currency, the value or the cost of that particular shopping cart at that moment, and then also the items, so the products that are actually within the cart as well. For purchase, again, we have currency as a required parameter, but in this case, we also have the transaction ID as a required parameter, and then also similar to the add to cart, we have value and items. So each e-commerce event will have its own set of required parameters that you must implement in order for the data to populate correctly within Google Analytics 4. So kind of stepping back to the mock transactions, again, this is how you will be able to understand how you can properly set up those parameters. So those parameters are basically pulled from the screenshot that you see here. So once you have created or completed your mock transaction, you'll be able to understand how Google understands each of these pieces of information. So you can see within the variables here, there's the transaction ID, there's the value, there's currency, there's items, there's additional pieces of information that will give you more context about the actual purchase event. So this is really highlighting the importance of mock transactions, because if you didn't have this, you wouldn't know how Google would differentiate the transaction ID, the value, and all of these pieces of information. So mock transactions and having the ability to complete them are very, very important. And so now that we have an understanding of the events, mock transactions, here is probably the most important event that you will use in GA4 e-commerce reporting, and that is tracking actual purchases. So in order to track product purchases and revenue, you need to manually set up this purchase event, typically through Google Tag Manager. So with the purchase event, the required parameters again are the transaction ID, the value, the items, and the currency. And so again, this webinar isn't necessarily about Google Tag Manager, but basically what you are going to do is use the data layer feature within Google Tag Manager to set each of those parameters. So you can see in the screenshot to the right, we have all of those required parameters set with a data layer value. So Google Tag Manager, again, is really going to be your friend here. There's more information on Google Tag Manager resources within the appendix. But basically, you can see here within Google Tag Manager, we've set the event name, we've set the required parameters with the data layers. So this particular configuration would then allow us to start seeing that monetization report populate within Google Analytics 4. If you wanted to track the add to cart events, view check or start checkout events, any sort of e-commerce event that you are interested in has to be set up individually through Google Tag Manager. So you won't start seeing add to cart data appear until you configure that particular event. So it's pretty similar to what you see here for the purchase event, but it is good to understand that you can't just flip a switch and have everything within the monetization report start showing up. you have to manually and individually set those components up. Hopefully in the future, Google will make it a little bit easier for us to access this e-commerce reporting, but this is how we have to go about it at the current time. And so lastly, we will wrap up with just some other GA4 considerations, some other functionalities for you to understand to better leverage the platform. The first is the search bar. So if you are having trouble accessing different reports, or if you have a question that you need answered, you can actually type that directly within the search bar within Google Analytics 4. It understands natural language, so you can type out a full question and it will provide you either with the report that you need or the actual answer itself. So the search bar is a really great way, again, to find the different areas of Google Analytics 4 that you need, but also get those quick questions answered in a pretty quick way. So the search bar is very, very helpful for especially those who are new to Google Analytics 4. We also have audiences, and if you have been using segments in Universal Analytics, this is pretty similar. GA4 audiences essentially allow you to group users together based on some sort of shared attribute or behavior. And similar with events, there are 4 types of audiences where we have predefined audiences, so audiences that Google Analytics 4 already has, and the audiences that are already available to you. Those are just all users and purchasers. So those, again, are just automatic. They are predefined. They come with Google Analytics 4. There are template audiences. So you have to just enter in certain values in order to complete the configuration. But GA4 has the templates nearly completed for you. Again, you just have to enter in values in order to have those fully configured. There are suggested audiences. So these are audiences that are already configured. They're based on popular use cases, but you will just have to enable them in order to use them. And then similarly, again, with events, we have custom audiences. So if you don't have an audience group that matches what your current needs are, you can just create a custom audience from scratch. You can see in the screenshot below, there's a blue new audience button. You just simply click that and you enter in the conditions or the shared attributes, behaviors, things like that. And then you can create and use your custom audience as well. So again, this is really helpful if you want to maybe focus just on your organic users. You want to focus on the users, only the users who've made purchases. So it's a really great way to segment the different types of users that come to your website. The advertising report is also super important to understand. This is where we can get a better understanding of how our advertising and marketing performance looks like. The advertising section has 2 main reports that come along with it. The first is model comparison. This is where you can compare your attribution models and see how long it takes for users to convert, what those interaction times look like, and which attribution models are most successful. You can also look at conversion paths to see the steps a user took in order to result in a conversion. And then again, you can really just understand which attribution models have the most efficient path to conversions. So it's a great way, again, just to understand how your overall advertising performance is looking and getting a sense of what the performance looks like based on those different attribution models. And the last thing that we always like to share is that Google has a GA4 demo account. So this is a really helpful platform and tool to leverage. It's free as long as you have an active Google account yourself. But basically, you can click on that link that you see within the intro paragraph there. But basically, you just click that link, and as long as you have your active Google account, you can access this GA4 demo property. It's an active property, and it shows you the different reports. You can explore GA4, you can experiment with different features, you can see what custom events look like, what those custom audiences look like. So it's a really great way to better learn and get more comfortable with Google Analytics 4. So again, you can click on that link, access this free GA4 property, and start getting acclimated with Google Analytics 4. Perfect. So we will wrap up the webinar. So again, Google Analytics 4 was really created to prepare us for those changing cookie restrictions, the privacy concerns, and our ability to actually collect the data itself. It's not currently required to have or even use a Google Analytics 4 property, but we at Anvil recommend to at least have a GA4 property and install one, again, to acquire that historical data to eventually use in the long run. GA4 is shifting to a more events-based model. So Google Analytics 4 is really focused on engagement, events, and conversions. It is really helpful to have Google Tag Manager. It's strongly recommended to install Google Analytics 4 and implement some of the event tracking that we covered in the previous slides. Within the Google Analytics 4 interface, we have the reports that are somewhat similar and somewhat different than Universal Analytics. Those Google Analytics 4 properties include the real-time report, we have acquisition, engagement, monetization and retention, and demographics and tech. E-commerce reporting is a little bit different. It does require the support of Google Tag Manager to implement those e-commerce events. And it's really important to remember and understand that GA4 events have very set naming conventions. They are case sensitive and they require certain parameters that must be followed in order for the GA4 events to populate correctly within Google Analytics 4. If you would like Anvil to help create a GA4 property for you, if you need help installing your GA4 property, or if you already have one and you're just wanting to make sure that it's fully optimized and good to go, you can always contact us at Anvil Media. Our team is always happy to help. We are here to support you. We are here to answer your questions. So please feel free to reach out if you need support with your Google Analytics properties, whether it's Universal or GA4. And as I mentioned, you can access this webinar deck through our website. It will be available for download, so you can have it to reference at a later point. And again, it will be really helpful if you are looking to complete any of the configurations we've talked about within this webinar. So again, it will be available for download. You can access the site through that link right there and download the webinar deck from our website. And so before we end the webinar, we did want to also bring to your attention, we have our upcoming April webinar fastly approaching. We will be talking about the metaverse. Our founder, Kent Lewis, he will be talking about how you can build a powerful marketing presence within the virtual world. So thank you again for joining us today to talk about Google Analytics 4, and please feel free to subscribe to our channel to make sure you don't miss any upcoming webinars, any of our brown bags and podcasts as well. So thank you so much, and we will see you next time.